She did not hear her come in. This was the thing Rosalind had returned to most often in the 2 years since. Not the pain, which had arrived later. Not the sound she had made when she woke, which she did not remember making, but had been told she made by the housemaid 3 doors down, who had heard it through 2 closed doors and a corridor. Not any of those things. The thing she returned to was the silence. The particular silence of a woman who had planned this carefully enough to move through a sleeping house without disturbing it, who had heated the iron in the kitchen hearth and wrapped it in cloth for carrying and unwrapped it at the threshold and done what she came to do, and then set it down and walked back out and closed the door behind her with the quiet, careful click of someone who has simply come to check on a window latch. Lady Maren had not needed to be cruel about it. She had only needed to be precise. Rosalind understood this now with the cold clarity of someone who has had 2 years to examine a single night from every available angle. It was not hatred that had brought Lady Maren through that door. It was arithmetic. The inheritance required marriageability. 3 dukes had expressed interest in the preceding year. Beauty was the variable Lady Maren could reach. She had reached it. The rest had followed with the particular inevitability of a correctly executed calculation. Rosalind had lain in her bed that morning, with her hand pressed against her face, and she had understood all of this within the first hour. Not because she was not in pain, she was in considerable pain, but because understanding was the only available form of resistance, and she had taken it with both hands, and she had not let go. Before we go any further, if you have ever been attacked in the one place you believed you were safe, this story is for you. Stay until the end. Because what happens in the 2 years after that night, and in the library of a house she was never supposed to enter, is not simply a story about what was done to her. It is a story about what she built from it, and about a man who learned to find a person in their words long before he ever found them in their face. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Hit the like button. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every single one of those actions reaches back to us. Now, back to Rosalind, because she has been translating his father's letters for 3 weeks, and he has just written something in the margin that was not about the translation at all. Rosalind's father had been a scholar of the particular and vanishing kind, a man who read in 4 languages and wrote in 3, and had filled the Voss household with books stacked in arrangements that only he fully understood, and that Rosalind had learned to navigate by the time she was 12. He had taught her French because he read French and needed someone to discuss it with. He had taught her Latin because he believed Latin was the architecture underneath everything else, and that understanding architecture made you better at everything built on top of it. He had taught her to play the piano because her mother had played, and he could not bear for the instrument to stand silent. He had not taught her to be wary of the people he trusted. This was his one significant failure, and it had not been a failure of intelligence, but of constitution. He was simply not built for wariness, in the way that certain people are simply not built for it, and the world had been gentle enough with him for long enough that he had not needed to develop it. Lady Maren had arrived in the Voss household when Rosalind was 16. She had been a widow of careful presentation, dark hair, precise manner, the particular warmth of a woman who has learned that warmth is the most effective available currency and deploys it with the skill of someone who has been spending it strategically for years. Rosalind had not been fooled. She had been 16 and perceptive, and she had watched Lady Maren with the systematic attention of someone who has learned to read people carefully and had seen, underneath the warmth, the arithmetic. She had said nothing. Her father was happy. The household ran smoothly. Lady Maren was, by every visible measure, an adequate wife to a man who needed very little from his marriage, because his marriage to his books was the consuming one. Rosalind had watched and waited, and told herself that at 21 she would be of age, and the question of Lady Maren would resolve itself on her own terms. She had not anticipated dying at 63 instead of 80. Her father's heart had simply stopped on a Wednesday morning in March, without warning or negotiation, the way hearts sometimes stop in men who have been working too hard for too long and have not noticed. Rosalind had been in the library when it happened. She had heard the sound of his chair and had known before she reached the doorway. The will had been read 3 weeks later. Everything to Rosalind, the estate, the books, The income contingent on her maintained good standing and marriageability until the age of 25. A standard provision. Her father's solicitor, an honest man named Whitmore, had drafted it with care. Her father had signed it with the trust of a man who had never needed to imagine what happened when the person managing the household had already identified the provision's mechanism and begun calculating how to use it. Lady Maren had read the will with appropriate grief. She had gone home and sat in her husband's chair, in her husband's study, and she had thought about marriageability, about the 3 dukes who had expressed interest in Rosalind in the preceding year, about the particular variable that produced that interest, about what happened to marriageability when that variable was removed and she had begun to calculate. It had taken her 4 months to decide, not because she was uncertain, but because she was thorough. She had considered every available option and eliminated each one, and arrived at the iron with the particular cold logic of a woman who has worked through everything else and found it insufficient. She had waited for the right night, a night when the housemaid was visiting her sister in the village, and the cook slept heavily, and the house was as quiet as it was going to be. She had been precise. She had been efficient. She had closed the door quietly behind her. Rosalind had been 19 years old. The physician had come in the morning. He was a man of 50, with the careful eyes of someone who has seen many things, and has learned to keep his assessments professional and his opinions private. He had dressed the wound. He had told her what the healing would look like and what it would leave behind. He had used the word permanent once and had not used it again. He had looked at Lady Maren when he left with an expression that was entirely neutral and entirely aware simultaneously, and had said nothing because there was nothing he could prove. Rosalind had healed in her room over 6 weeks. She had not wept in front of anyone. She had wept alone at 3 in the morning, on the 4th night, when the pain was its worst. And she had permitted herself exactly that, the single private accounting for what had been done. And then she had set it aside and begun to think about what came next. What came next was the veil. A simple, dark veil, worn in public not to hide, she told herself, but to manage the reactions of other people which were, without exception, worse than the reality of what they were reacting to. She had worn it for 2 years. She had stopped noticing it in the way you stop noticing something that has become simply part of how you move through the world. She had also, in those 2 years, become more entirely herself than she had been before the iron. This was the thing she had not expected, and could not have predicted, that the removal of beauty as a social variable would leave her with only what was actually hers. The languages, the music, the particular quality of attention she gave to everything that mattered. The mind her father had spent years developing and had left her as the most durable thing in his inheritance. She had begun translating privately French correspondence, Latin documents, German letters for county families who needed things understood and did not have the languages themselves. The work had spread by word of mouth, the way good, quiet work spread slowly, and then all at once. She worked from home. She did not receive visitors. She was, by the beginning of 1884, the most sought-after private translator in 3 counties and the least visible person in any of them. This was the situation when the Duke of Aldenmere's secretary wrote to ask whether she would consider a private commission. His name was Sebastian Carew. He was 31 years old and had been the Duke of Aldenmere for 3 years. Following his father's death, a man who had managed the transition with the competent and slightly mechanical attention of someone who had prepared for it intellectually without being entirely prepared for it emotionally, which was the only honest way to prepare for inheriting a dead man's life. His father had left, among other things, a chest of correspondence. Letters in French, 40 years of them, from colleagues and friends, and one sustained correspondence with a woman in Lyon, whose relationship to his father Sebastian could not determine from the handwriting alone, because his French was insufficient, and his father had never mentioned her. He had been wanting them translated for 2 years. He had asked 3 translators. The first had been adequate. The second had been accurate but had missed every register change in the original, which was the most important thing to miss. The third had returned the commission after a week, with a note explaining that the French was too idiomatic for her to manage with confidence. His secretary had made inquiries in 3 counties. 2 sources had returned the same name independently. Miss Rosalind Voss. Works from home. Does not receive visitors. The best available. Sebastian had written to her on a Tuesday in January. He had explained the commission, the letters, the 40 years, the woman in Lyon he needed to understand. He had said he would pay whatever rate she considered appropriate. He had said he was less interested in literal accuracy than in understanding what his father had actually meant, and what the people writing to him had actually meant, and whether those were the same thing. She had written back on Thursday. She had accepted. She had named a rate that was precise and fair, and entirely without the social hesitation of someone adjusting their price for a duke. She had said she would have the first batch completed within 10 days, and that she would add notes where the register suggested something the literal translation could not capture. He had received the first batch in 11 days. She had apologized for the extra day and a single line at the top of the first page. That was so dry he had read it twice to confirm it was an apology. The translations were extraordinary. Not simply accurate, alive, the way certain translations are alive when the person doing them understands that language is not a code to be decrypted, but a texture to be matched. She had rendered his father's colleagues' formal French into formal English that felt like the same person rather than a different person speaking more slowly. She had rendered the Lion woman's letters warmer, more personal, the register of someone writing to a person they knew completely into English that made Sebastian sit very still for a long time after reading it. He had written back the same evening. He had thanked her. He had asked about the 3rd letter in the 2nd batch, a short note from Lyon that seemed to him to be about something other than what it said. He had asked what she thought. She had written back in 2 days. She had told him what she thought directly, without the social qualification of someone managing a professional relationship carefully. She thought the letter was a farewell. She thought the register shift in the final paragraph indicated the writer knew it was the last letter she intended to send and was choosing her final words with the particular attention people give to things they know are final. She thought his father had known this when he received it and had kept the letter because knowing and reading were different kinds of having. Sebastian had read this and then read it again. Then he had sat in his library for a long time, thinking about his father in a way he had not been able to think about him since the funeral. Not the institutional management of grief, but the real version, the one that arrived when something true was said about someone you had lost. He had written back. Not about the translation, about his father, about what the letters were revealing, about whether she thought the woman in Lyon had loved him, about what 40 years of correspondence meant about a life. He had written more honestly than he had intended to write, to a translator he had never met. She had written back. She had answered every question directly. She had also, at the bottom of the letter, written a single additional line. Your father kept her letters in a separate box from the others. That is also a kind of answer. Sebastian had looked at this line for a long time. Then he had written back, asking if he could come and meet her. She had said no. He had asked again 3 weeks later. She had said no again, not unkindly, simply directly, in the way she said everything. The 3rd time, he did not write. He simply arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, with his secretary's apologies and his own without them, and stood in the hallway of the Voss household and asked if Miss Voss would receive him. Rosalind had been in the library when Gaines came to tell her. She had sat for a moment with the letter she was working on a German commission, dense and formal, and she had made her decision with the particular deliberateness of a woman who has had 2 years to decide what she is and is not willing to manage. She had put on the veil. She had gone downstairs. He was standing near the bookshelves when she entered the library. He had been looking at the titles, not performing interest, actually reading them, running his finger along the spines with the absorbed attention of someone who finds books naturally interesting, and had stopped at a volume of Montaigne that was showing its age along the spine. He turned when she came in. He saw the veil. Something moved in his face that she had learned to read in 2 years of social encounters, the particular sequence of recognition and adjustment that most people performed when they saw her for the first time. She waited for the sequence to complete. It did not complete. He looked at her for one moment, and then he looked at the Montaigne in his hand and said, "Your father's." "His annotating hand," she said. "Every margin. Did you read the annotations?" "I wrote some of them," she said. "We argued in the margins." He looked at her, not at the veil, at her, with the particular quality of attention she had come to associate from the letters, with someone who was genuinely interested in the answer to the question he had just asked, rather than the question being a social mechanism. "Who won?" he said. "Montaigne," she said. "Generally." He sat down. She sat across from him. He asked about the third letter in the second batch, the Lyon farewell, and whether on reflection she had changed her reading of the final paragraph or maintained it. They talked for 2 hours. He asked precise questions and listened to the full answers and followed each one to its actual end, rather than to the point where a polite response became available. She found herself saying things she had not planned to say, not personal things, precise things, exact things, the kind of things that only emerge when the person you are talking to is genuinely capable of receiving them. He forgot about the veil within 20 minutes. She noticed the exact moment, a particular quality of focused attention that simply no longer included it as a variable. She had been waiting for this moment for 2 years, in every social encounter she had managed, and had not found it once. She found it now in a man who had arrived without being invited, and asked about Montaigne, and genuinely wanted to know who had won the argument. He came back the following Tuesday. He brought the next batch of letters himself, rather than sending them by post, and stayed for an hour and a half. He came back the Tuesday after that, and the one after that. By the 5th Tuesday, Lady Maron had begun watching from the upper corridor when his carriage arrived, and Rosalind had noticed her watching and had said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. By the 6th Tuesday, Lady Maron had sent for a physician. She was discreet about it. She believed she was being discreet. She engaged a London physician through an intermediary and described the case in general terms: a burn scar of 2 years on the face, the best available treatment, the most current options for reduction. She did this carefully and privately, and with the particular confidence of a woman who has managed difficult things before and trusts her own capacity for management. She did not account for the servant. There is always a servant. In this case, it was a girl of 17 named Polly, who had been in the Voss household for 8 months and who had overheard the conversation with the intermediary, and who had a cousin who worked at the Aldenmere estate and who had mentioned it. Not maliciously, simply as an interesting thing that had happened. Over a shared meal on a Sunday, the Duke's secretary had mentioned it to the Duke on a Monday morning. Sebastian had sat with it for the rest of that day. Then he had sent for his own physician, a man of 60, with considerable experience in burn injuries from his years of military service, and he had described the scarring pattern he had observed in his brief and indirect views of Rosalind's face beneath the veil, and he had asked what instrument would produce that specific pattern on a sleeping person. The physician had been very still for a moment. Then he had told him. Sebastian had sent for Whitmore, Rosalind's father's solicitor, the honest one, the following morning. The county dinner was on a Friday evening in April. Rosalind had agreed to attend because Sebastian had asked in the particular way. He asked things directly, without social performance, with the clear implication that he was asking because he wanted her present and not for any other reason. She had worn the dark blue dress her mother had made for her at 17, and the veil, and she had arrived in the Aldenmere carriage because he had sent it, and she had decided that accepting it was the correct response. Lady Maron was already seated when Rosalind arrived. She had positioned herself 3 places from the Duke, with the practiced social arithmetic of a woman who knows exactly how close to power she is permitted to place herself without appearing to reach for it. Her daughter, Cecily, sat beside her in pale pink silk, and the particular expression of someone who has been told what to do this evening and is concentrating on doing it. Rosalind was placed at Sebastian's right hand. She had not known this, and he had not told her, and when she reached her chair and understood the positioning, she looked at him briefly, and he looked back with the complete and entirely unperformative expression of a man who has placed her there because that is where she belongs and has nothing further to say about it. The dinner proceeded through 3 courses. Lady Maron spoke twice, once about the county assembly, and once about the new vicar's sermons, with the composed social ease of a woman who has no reason to expect the evening to disturb her. Sebastian set down his fork at the end of the third course. He did not call for silence. He simply stopped speaking to the person beside him, and the quality of his stillness was such that the table adjusted to it without being asked. He looked at Lady Maron. "Lady Maron," he said, "3 weeks ago you engaged a physician through a Mr. Gerald Hatch of Harley Street to inquire about treatment for a burn scar of approximately 2 years in duration on a young woman's face. I would like to know why." The table was completely silent. Lady Maron's composure held for 4 seconds. Rosalind counted them. She had been watching Lady Maron's face since she sat down with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly what they are watching for, and she saw the 4 seconds, the rapid calculation, the assessment of available options, the decision to hold the composure. And she saw what happened at the end of the 4 seconds. When Lady Maron looked at her, and understood from Rosalind's expression that Sebastian already had everything, and that the question was not a question. "I was concerned for my stepdaughter's welfare," Lady Maron said, "as any mother would be." "As any mother," Sebastian said. "Yes." He reached into his coat. He placed 3 documents on the table: the physician's written account of the consultation, Whitmore's legal assessment of the inheritance provision, and a single page in Sebastian's own hand, describing the specific pattern of the scarring, as confirmed by his military physician, and the instrument that produced it. "The iron is in the Voss household inventory," he said. "Item 47. It has a specific irregularity in the left handle, a repair made in 1879 that produced an asymmetry in the base plate. My steward identified it 3 weeks ago. My physician confirmed the match to the scarring pattern yesterday." He looked at Lady Maron with the complete and unhurried attention of a man who has built something that will hold weight and is watching it hold. "I would like you to correct the record," he said. "Here, now, before these witnesses." Lady Maron sat with her spine straight and her hands folded, and her expression holding by the particular effort of a woman whose composure has been the primary instrument of her entire adult life, and is discovering that an instrument requires something to stand on, and the something is gone. She said nothing. Sebastian nodded. Once the small, precise nod of a man who has received the answer he expected and has already prepared for it. He turned to Rosalind. He did not ask. He looked at her, the grey eyes, the complete attention, the expression of a man who has decided something and is asking permission not to do it but to do it correctly. She reached up. She removed the veil herself. She set it on the table beside her plate, with the particular deliberateness of a woman making a decision she has been building toward for 2 years, and has now made completely and without remainder. The room looked at her face. The scar, the left side, from the temple to the jaw, the particular texture of healed burn tissue that 2 years had softened but not removed, her face, all of it. She looked at the room with the direct and unperformative attention she gave to everything that mattered, and she did not look away from any of it. Sebastian looked at her for 1 moment with the expression she had come to associate over 4 months of Tuesdays and letters and arguments about Montaigne, with his version of complete and unguarded certainty, not happiness, performed. Simply the particular stillness of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. "Miss Rosalind Voss," he said to the room, "the finest mind I have encountered in 31 years. I intend to marry her. I thought you should all see her clearly." Lady Maron left the dinner before dessert. She left the county within the fortnight. The legal proceedings regarding the inheritance provision and the documented assault took the better part of a year and concluded in a manner that satisfied Whitmore enormously, and that Rosalind followed with the systematic attention of a 40-woman watching something she has been owed for 2 years arrive at its correct destination. Cecily wrote Rosalind a letter from Bath in the summer. It was not an apology. She was not constituted for apology, having been shaped entirely by someone else's agenda for 20 years. But it was honest in the careful way of someone attempting honesty for perhaps the first time, and finding it uncomfortable, and doing it anyway. Rosalind read it twice. She wrote back 2 sentences, direct, accurate, neither warm nor cold. Cecily wrote again. They corresponded occasionally after that, in the careful way of two people who share a complicated history and have decided that occasional, honest correspondence is better than permanent silence. Polly received a permanent position at Aldenmere, with a significant increase in her wages. Sebastian arranged this without telling Rosalind, and she found out from Polly herself, and said nothing to him about it for 3 days, and then said, "Polly tells me you have given her a position." She told the truth to someone who needed to hear it, he said. That seemed worth compensating. Rosalind looked at him. "You are very consistent," she said. "I try to be," he said. She had said yes 3 weeks before this conversation, not to a formal proposal. Sebastian was not a man who made performances of things that did not require them, but to a direct and unhurried statement delivered in the Voss library on a Tuesday afternoon that he intended to marry her if she was willing, and that he had been building towards saying this since the letter about his father's box of correspondence, and that he did not intend to qualify it or delay it any further. She had looked at him for a long moment. She had thought about the mirror she no longer avoided, the veil she no longer wore. The face she had decided 2 years ago belonged to her, and not to Lady Marin's calculation of what it was worth. She had thought about her father in the library arguing with Montaigne in the margins. "Yes," she said. "I have been waiting for you to say that since the letter about the lion woman." He looked at her. "That was 4 months ago." "Yes," she said. "You took your time. I was being thorough," he said. "I know," she said. "I appreciated it." They were married in June in the Aldenmere chapel, small, deliberate, entirely theirs. Whitmore attended and wept openly during the vows and was unembarrassed about it. Polly attended in a new dress and cried into her handkerchief from the second row. Henry the steward attended because Sebastian had told him that finding the iron in the inventory had been the act that made everything possible, and that this seemed worth acknowledging with an invitation. Rosalind wore no veil. She had not worn one since the county dinner, and she did not intend to begin again for her own wedding. She wore her mother's ivory dress taken in at the waist, let out at the shoulders, smelling faintly of cedar from the chest. It had waited in for 20 years, and her father's copy of Montaigne in her dress pocket, because she had decided he should be present in the only way still available to him. Sebastian held both her hands during the vows. He looked at her face, all of it, the scar, the dark eyes, the jaw that was her father's, with the complete and deliberate attention of a man who has been looking carefully for 4 months and intends to keep looking carefully for the remainder of the available time. The Lion Woman's letters were translated and bound in a single volume that year. Sebastian had them placed in the Aldenmere library, between the Montaigne and a volume of French poetry his father had annotated in the margins. Rosalind added a note at the front of the translated volume, not about the translation, about what 40 years of letters meant about a life. She wrote it in the same direct and unqualified way. She wrote everything, and Sebastian read it 3 times and said it was the finest thing in the volume. And she said that was because the original French was the finest thing in the volume. And he said he was talking about the note, and she said she knew. The scar did not fade. She had known it would not fade. She had stopped looking at it in the mirror not because she had stopped seeing it, but because she had decided, with the particular deliberateness of a woman who makes decisions carefully and keeps them, that it was simply part of her face, and her face was simply her face. And Lady Marin did not get to determine what that meant. She played the piano in the evenings, in the Aldenmere drawing room. No veil. The particular absorption of someone doing the thing they do best, in a room where they are entirely safe to do it. Sebastian sat in the chair by the window on these evenings, with whatever he was reading, and he did not always listen, and he did not pretend to always listen, and sometimes he simply sat in the same room as the music, the way you sit in the path. Same room as something that is very good and does not require your commentary to continue being good. These were the evenings Rosalind liked best. Not the formal occasions, not the social occasions, not even the Tuesdays in the library with the letters spread between them. These evenings, the piano, the chair by the window, the particular quality of a room that has finally become what it was always supposed to be. She played. He read. The Aldenmere drawing room held them both in the quiet and generous way of rooms that have been waiting a long time for the right people to inhabit them correctly. Outside, the June evening was long and warm and entirely indifferent to its own beauty the way June evenings are. And inside the drawing room, a woman played the piano with her scarred face turned toward the keys and her father's Montaigne in her dress pocket, and the whole of her life arranged around her exactly as it should be. This is where Rosalind's story ends. Not in a bedroom in the dark. Not in 2 years of veils and careful management, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been reading people's first reactions for so long, she has stopped being surprised by them. It ends here, in a room with good light, at a piano, playing. What Lady Marin did was not simply violent. It was calculated. She looked at her stepdaughter's beauty, and identified it as the mechanism through which her inheritance would be secured. And she removed that mechanism with the cold precision of a woman who had spent 4 months thinking about nothing else. She was not wrong that beauty was a variable. She was wrong in the way that people are wrong. When they reduce a person to a single variable and forget that the person is larger than any variable they possess. Rosalind was not her face. She was the thing that had been reading and translating and arguing in margins since she was 12 years old, and that had survived everything the preceding years had required of it, and that had found in the 2 years of veils and careful management, not ruin, but a different kind of truth. The truth of a person stripped of everything that was not entirely theirs, and discovering that what remained was considerable. Sebastian did not save her. He read her letters. He came on a Tuesday, without being invited. He asked about Montaigne, and genuinely wanted to know who had won. He found the iron, and built the case, and stood up at a county dinner, and said her name clearly in a room full of people who had been averting their eyes for 2 years. He did all of this, but Rosalind had been herself, entirely, precisely, without remainder long before Sebastian Carew arrived. He had simply been paying the kind of attention that made it impossible to miss. Thank you for staying to the very end. If Rosalind's story moved something in you, if the image of a woman removing her own veil and setting it on the table stayed with you, then please do one thing right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. Every single one of you matters to this library. Until next time, the doors are always open.